Under the sky, we slept last night, just you and me. Oh, what a day, what a day, glorious. The waning moon, our cycle is almost complete. We've got good friends to the left of us and good friends to our right. We've got the open sky above us and the earth beneath our feet. Never fear, the birds are singing, even endings can be sweet. Oh, what a day.
Welcome everyone from all around the world, it looks like. I'm Lise Melvin. I'm the Programme Director here at the Strozzi Institute, and I'm your host today. And it's my pleasure to be here with Richard Strozzi Heckler, pioneer in the field of somatics coaching and embodied leadership, best-selling author and founder of the Strozzi Institute. We are here to celebrate the launch of his 9th book, Embodying the Mystery, Somatic Wisdom for Emotional, Energetic, and Spiritual Awakening. Richard has spent over 5 decades researching, developing, and teaching somatics to business leaders, executive managers, teams from Fortune 500 companies, non-governmental organizations, technology startups, non-profits, the US government, and the military. Richard was named one of the top 50 executive coaches in the art and practice of leadership coaching and in profiles in coaching. He is the co-founder of the Mid-East Aikido project, which brings together Palestinians and Israelis through the practice of Aikido. In addition to being the author of now 9 books, Richard has a PhD in psychology and is a Shihan 7th degree black belt in the martial art of Aikido. We're so glad to be here with you, Richard, to celebrate the launch of this new book. Welcome, Richard. Oh, you're on mute, Richard.
That wouldn't, being on mute would not be good for a book reading. And thank you for that. And it's really good to see a lot of very familiar faces and new faces and places from all over the world. And I don't know if Lise mentioned it, but she's coming to us from Costa Rica, which is her HQ. Before we move forward, let's just take a moment, as we do at Strozzi Institute, and just get our sense presence and open and connected, and really dropping into our bodies, our felt experience of life. So we have a good ground. Our feet are on the ground. You can feel our sit bones. If you're in a chair, you can feel your back against the chair. Otherwise, opening into your back, your spine, the back of your heart. And a dropped, open, rhythmic breath. I see there's a number of people here who have been in courses with me, either in organizations or at the ranch. And you know that it was a good 1.5 years that when everybody spoke their declaration, their commitment, mine was this book. And here it is. So what can we say? The power of declarations again. Power of declarations. Before I begin, and I'm going to, the program will be, I'll be reading from the book, be making some comments about it. At the end, we'll leave space open for any Q&A and any announcements coming from Strozzi at the very, very end. And I think it's important for you to know that what's in this book is very personal. It really is about many of the things in my life that had a very major impact for me. and many of the really important teachers, guides, and mentors that opened doors for me. And inside of this personal account about what does it mean to live in a human body, really, what does it mean to live in a human body, is what this book is about. And my personal experience is that really is located in me growing up in the mid 20th century as a white male, a white heterosexual male, really from a working class background. And the stories go all the way from I'm about 7 or 8 years old, all the way till I'm, well, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But that social location is really important to see because, like all of us, we live in the social locations, and it has major influence on our life. And what I'd like to do here is I would like to start reading the introduction, or parts of the introduction, because it says much about this journey of my life. I think that there's universal themes in it for many lives, and that what it has opened for me. My quest to understand the mystery that is human life began with the influence of my grandmother's early teachings on the nature of spirit. And I will read something about her just later, but that's a basic theme, the theme of my grandmother's teaching, as well as a number of other people's teachings. Along the way, there were a number of significant teachers and events that opened a view into a way of being that had no previous location in my life. These occurrences were signposts and confirmations of a landscape, both inner and outer, that pointed to an ineffable mystery that was alive and potent. They pointed to a life of deep questing and reflection, a life that would be filled with purpose, struggle, and meaning, of purpose, of peace and belonging. I was drawn to this state even though I had neither language to express it nor a historical lineage that gave it standing. But what evolved was a longing. Longing is also a major theme here. But what evolved was a longing that became a force unto itself, a deep impulse that inexplicably moved me to seek the answers to what it meant to be in a human body with one's feet firmly on the ground while reaching for the heavens. Along the way, it became more evident that the heaven I was being pulled toward was within me. As Henry David Thoreau said, it is in vain to dream of a wilderness distant from ourselves. This book was initiated by a marveling and adventurous longing to explore, and follows a shifting thread of continuity rather than any pedagogical urge to tell. It is not meant to instruct or distill something into a lesson, but to have a lingering presence of what an embodied reality offers. It provides no formulas or prescriptions, only an explorer's insistence to go over the next hill, literally, metaphorically, and physically. And a comment about that is that I would like to just reiterate that this book, unlike my other books, really is not speaking about the distinctions around leadership necessarily, the practices around leadership, or prescriptions of how one may have a more fulfilling life, or anything of that sort. It really is a compilation of incidences, phenomena, experiences, fine teachers, mentors, guides, coaches, that opened up the richness for me that life can be. And so in part of this is I will speak about something, then I'll have something in italics that are my reflections on it. So I'm going to move forward here and say at the end of this piece of introduction, it says this journey is taken from over 50 years of working with a wide range of individuals, teams, and organizations in embodied leadership, somatic coaching, martial arts, body-oriented therapy, and meditation. You can tell I'm just getting my voice here. It's unusual for me to be on Zoom and be reading, not looking at you all, looking at that little green light. The infrastructure underneath these practices comprises the disciplines of meditation, somatics, and Aikido. The foundation between the infrastructure is made up of a legion of exemplary, quirky, ordinary, extraordinary, and otherworldly teachers, beloved all. So I bow into all those teachers and all those people that have helped bring me to this point and open up these possibilities that what it means to be truly in a human body where our feet are firmly on the ground and we can have a moral and spiritual vision. I like to read this very first chapter because it reveals a theme that goes throughout this book and throughout my life. And the title of this chapter is called Life Fastened to Death. This incident happened in a naval base where I was living, coming from a military family, up in the Seattle area. When I was 8 years old, I would routinely explore the woods that were on the perimeter of the Navy base that was my home. I would travel with a group of friends, and on one particular day, we decided to go to a creek far away from our usual haunts. As we cleared the thick hardwood forest, we saw something lying in the gravelly shallows. It was a large yellow dog. Yet even at a distance, I could tell there was something untoward about it. It was completely still, unlike anything I'd ever seen before, and nearly indescribable. There was a profound silence emanating from it that utterly disregarded my reality of what I knew a dog to be. The stillness was full of import and something entirely unknown to me. We walked slowly forward and saw that it was dead, freshly dead. There were no marks on it, no trauma, nothing to indicate that it was either sick or old or had died violently. Some of the other boys poked at it with a stick or threw pebbles at it. I was fully mesmerized. It looked like a dog sleeping, but something was missing. It was what was missing that captured me. That evening, when I told my grandmother what I had seen, my mother immediately went into a germ story. You shouldn't go near it. It might be diseased. You don't want to touch it. Did you touch it? She asked. It looked like it was sleeping, but it wasn't. What was that? I asked. My grandmother nodded. Its spirit was gone. It might have germs, my mother said. Don't go back, she interrupted, ignoring my grandmother. Promise me you won't go back. I don't want you to get a disease. I went back the next day. This revealed a characteristic of my nature that bucks authority. It also foreshadowed a tendency to refrain from fully disclosing my intentions so I could do what I wanted. This became a standard way for me to navigate the complexities of my family dynamic and supported my penchant for adventure. but later it matured into a psychological liability that created numerous breakdowns and required hours of therapy. I gently touched the dog first with a stick and then with my finger. It felt intimate, yet impersonal. It looked like a dog, but what made it a dog was no longer present. It was a house without a resident, a vacant body in a doorway to the unknown. What is spirit? Where is spirit? When my grandmother spoke of it, it seemed so tangible and commonsensical, no more mysterious than taking off a shoe. Yet it was ineffable. It had no real location, but existed everywhere. Her response ignited something in me like a second heartbeat, a distinctive pulse that permeated everything. A mystery had been presented that was enigmatic, seemingly unsolvable, yet as tangible as the next breath. These questions I would wonder about for the rest of my life, right up to this moment of tapping these keys. As if in a spell, I went back to the creek every day, often alone. I was captivated. My curiosity was like magnetic filings embedded in my marrow, and the dog was pulling me forward to something formless, unknown. This was an urge that was larger than me. A flood of sensation that had had its own way with me apart from any conscious choice. This was not a hankering after a simple desire like a candy bar, but something I now know was spiritual hunger. A charge of aliveness that began at the center of my chest and seemed to usurp the me that was accustomed to making mental choices. This feeling, this longing, pulled me as a river would and formed a new reality composed of the intimate connection between life and death. A great circle of change and transformation played out before me in real time, and I was enthralled by the mystery of it. I began to see that what looked like a dog began to sag and was eventually reduced to an unnameable mass that repealed everything it had ever been. A dark premonition sharpened my senses and silhouetted the depth and granularity of my longing. What began to take shape in the core of my being was an understanding that the covenant of spirit was intimately matched with the vulnerability of the incarnate life. Death, loss, change, and birth were deeply woven into the fabric of spirit and mystery. What came to form would pass. In my daily treks to what I call Dog Creek, I was shown how endings were accompanied by new beginnings. There was something perpetually wanting to come to form out of the ending I was witnessing at the creek. As the days passed, the stillness of the dog was replaced by a relentless shimmering laced into the very animal itself. Hordes of ants, spiders, maggots, and things that looked like spastic black apostrophes were colonizing the dog. Then gaping holes in the hide appeared, showing putrefaction and rib. The fluted sound of the creek folded into the song of the crickets, tree frogs, and whippoorwills, a background symphony to the theater of change. Ravens sat watching in the gloom of overhead boughs, waiting to return to their task once I left. I was alone in the sense of not being with another human, but I was never lonely. There's aliveness too in these exacting moments of ending. Movement becomes stillness, which becomes movement in the unending wheel of life expressed. By week's end, the dog was only a suggestion of what it once was, becoming a ripple in the current of the stream itself. The smell was bracing. the reek of death caught in my nose, insisting on its place in every breath. And I have this piece of a few sentences that's in italics here. And as I said before, the italics goes to the place of, oh, these are the thoughts and the images reoccurring. Life fastened to death. Instead of calling it living and dying, should it be termed living dying? Just as in China, they don't say yin and yang, but yin yang. Is spirit the thread that unifies death and birth? A particular entropy now appeared everywhere I looked. Everything dissolved back into a larger pre-existing order that was without nostalgia or sentimentality. There was an unnameable darkness that I couldn't touch orbiting around me. This ceremony of ruin and renovation is best viewed at a distance. Up close, it's difficult to see its dark gift. Deep in my tissues, where this primal opening to life, to spirit, was twined with death, a central theme about existence appeared. There is a polarity, endlessly acting on itself and the world, opening and closing, receiving and giving, living and dying, flexing and extending, lighting and shading, making and unmaking. As Ovid said, everything is changing into something else. As Ovid said, everything is changing into something else. Again, this little piece that's in italics. In their interacting of these polarities, the engine that creates the whole, the direct, unmediated experience of unity. I'll read again, is the intersecting of these polarities, the engine that creates the whole, the direct, unmediated experience of unity. Is this the womb out of which there is a ground of being that holds this polarity? Is there something deeper and wider that has the space to hold opposites, contradictions, paradoxes? The in-your-face actuality of decay revealed a shadow that hovered over everything that accompanied me as I walked the trail home. Every opening was preceded by a contraction. There was an animating principle, a spirit that invoked a metamorphosis, a constantly changing fabric that included disintegration and renewal. Conspicuously, life feeds off of life. Life is spirit, and in that tension, there's a mystery that calls for surrender to something larger than the duality of subject and object. As I stood in the clearing, I wondered if the horizon, gigantic as it seemed, was big enough to hold these seemingly opposites. Something masked at the edge of my skin that reached for the depthless sky, an inexplicable quality of relentlessness, lost, felt, and known deeply, and a relentless life that surges in widening circles where thought cannot follow. Life is not a pouch of gold coins that we must spend prudently and not all at once. Life is infinite. It doesn't run out. Yes, I will run out of life, just as we all will, but the world will never run out of life. As the poet Mary Oliver so elegantly states, there are the woods you love, where the secret name of every death is life again. Again, Mary Oliver, she was one of our national living treasures. These are the woods you love, where the secret name of every death is life again. I say the shadow side of life, of love, is loss. So I begin here because it really has these themes of the tremendous import that my grandmother had about me. And I'll read a piece about her later. And also as, you know, being 7 and 8 and seeing this dead thing for the very first time. And it held such a mystery for me. And that for her to name it and say it's spirit. And she became a teacher for me to how to feel, perceive, to be with, and eventually to surrender to spirit. So this notion of impermanence, this notion of having a primary teacher, fundamental basic teacher who holds a ground of being, and also that life replenishes itself. It's life moving towards life, life affirming life. Eight years later, so now I'm about 16, I think it's just before my 17th birthday, I again experienced life fastening itself to death. During a calving operation on the family ranch in Montana, I helped pull the calf from a struggling mother with my Uncle Sonny. We attached a rope from the calf's protruding foot to a saddle horn, and I heeled the horse slowly forward as Uncle Sonny maneuvered the rope until first the hind legs, then the torso and forelegs, and finally the bloody calf came free. The mother bled out, the calf lived. I watched in bafflement as one life ended and another life began. After a few wobbly moments, the calf stood by its mother on shaky legs, peering expectantly at the lifeless form which she had been a part of just moments before. While my Uncle Sonny had seen many animals perish by his hand and by the force of nature, and was normally stoic and stalwart, he was shaken in a way that disoriented me, as if the spinning world was having its way with him. The dog sniffed at the lifeless heifer and then began licking the blood pooling on the dead hard pan, quarreling and snapping, the hair on their backs bristling. Uncle Sonny hazed them off with his hat, and they shied away. The continuity of the world endured as if nothing untoward had occurred at all. My uncle pulled a Pall Mall out of his shirt pocket and lit it with his Zippo lighter and printed it with USMC First Division. For those that you don't know, USMC means United States Marine Corps. He held me in his gaze, cigarette dangling from his lip, turned both hands up, empty, shrug, and began wiping the calf down. Shit, he said. Something raw and tender passed between us. But as I was learning what he already knew, men don't linger with their feelings, especially with each other. So I undid the kerchief from my neck and joined him wiping off the afterbirth, steaming and warm. Shit, he said again. Like a small sharp splinter caught under the skin, the memory of the lifeless dog unexpectedly pierced my thoughts. There was a sacred confirmation in this ancient ritual of bringing life to term. Dog, cow, calf, horse, man, blood darkening the ground, vultures swimming overhead in the thermals, and the earth seething with heat. Under the impossibly blue sky, we were a frank symmetry of life begetting death, or was it death begetting life? My breath was urgent. Something was pressed against my chest, demanding release. Again, the italics. What does it mean to have a life? What does it mean to have a life? What does it mean to be in a body, to have thoughts, to be someone? What does it mean to die, to lose a life, to no longer be in a body? But there was no time for reflection. New life called. We tied and penned the calf, cut the umbilical cord, and dragged the dead heifer off behind our horses for the vultures and coyotes and all manner of things to transform it to another form of life. At the conclusion of the complex calculations that science offers us about life is where the mystery begins. Just as when my grandmother pointed to life everywhere, I was entranced when my uncle mumbled shit in consternation and held up his hands helplessly, as if there was nothing to hold but the shining emptiness of the moment. I've often wondered, I still wonder, he's gone, but I've often wondered if his tender lament was part of his abiding healing from being gut shot at Peleliu, where he almost bled out, but survived to witness death and birth again in a different form. The transformation of the dog at death and later the cow was mirrored by a transformation in me, that imprinted signpost to reflect upon, wrestle with, try on, and eventually embody. Witnessing the radical transformation of something known and familiar to something utterly unrecognizable revealed not only the mystery of an animating principle called spirit, but the intersecting alliances of change, loss, and renewal. In italics, a central question lodged in me. A central question lodged in me as the middle of my teenage years. How was spirit embodied? How do we live from this deeper wisdom? I have some places marked here as I go through that. Yeah. The first person title of this chapter is called Baba. Baba. My grandmother's name was Alba Anderson. She immigrated from Sweden when she was about 14 or 15. And so I called her Baba. The first person to hold the mysteries of spirit, energy, and metamorphosis was my grandmother. She arrived in this country with her sister Alma at the age of 15 by boat from Olden, Sweden, making it through Ellis Island with a few coins in her pocket, and eventually settled in Montana, where there was a growing Swedish community. I was her first grandchild, and I pronounced her name Baba, which stuck as even now, my sister's grandchildren call her Baba. When her work at the local hospital was done for the day, Baba led seances and led psychic readings for her community of Swedish immigrants. She read palms, she read tea leaves. On Friday nights, I would stand by her side as she sat at a round table with others in a darkened room, a single candle throwing shadows against the stolid figures and the bare walls. She would ask aloud the questions put forth by the petitioners to their ancestors and the relatives who had passed over, and the table leg would knock once for no and twice for yes in answer to the questions. The candle flame would twist and right itself as the table moved, and the shadows would then settle down in the stillness of the uncomplicated response. It was as straightforward as the darkness itself. The simple interaction with the unseen was the norm. This simple interaction with the unseen was the norm. There were no pretensions about it at all. It was simply what we did while others watched the Jackie Gleason show. I know there's people from all around the world here, but at that point in my life, about being 6, 7, 8, 9, and our TVs were like 4 inches by 4 inches. There was a thing called the Jackie Gleason show. So while people were watching the Gleason show, this is what we did on Friday nights. It was like gathering around a two-way radio or a conference call and having a conversation with someone you never saw, except in this case, they were dead. Certainly they no longer reside in the human body, yet something was present. When we dialed into a certain frequency, suddenly something arose out of nothing. What was calculated into me is that life can be present in forms that are far from the norm. Later in college, when I was seeking identity and belonging through intellectual pursuits, I would question how the table had moved and be suspicious of the entire ceremony. It's always kind of painful for me to remember that. You know, I was the first person in my family to go to university, and it felt like, oh, I could, if I really put my shoulder to the wheel here and got smart, that would be what you did at that point. I would question how the table had moved and the suspicion of the entire ceremony. But the notion of invisible worlds that are both near and far away, intimate yet impersonal, found a place in me. This became an internal guidepost that was made plausible by practices of meditation and Aikido and learning to listen deeply to the space between the stimulus and the response. You know, and I'll say that the imprint that my grandmother had on me, other people when I was younger too, but her in such a positive way. Some of the other imprints weren't so positive, but her in that positive way just went deeply into my bone marrow, deeply into the nucleus of my cells. And I knew that I wasn't alone. I saw how other people treated her. You know, she was very humble. She worked cleaning bedpans and making beds in hospitals and comforting the sick. But people that, like my father, for example, who mostly, I'd say almost 99% of the people that met him were afraid of him. He was actually very respectful of her and kept his distance from her. So not only did she impact me this way, I saw how she impacted the world too. And also this notion of, you know, we would be in this room and we would come out and all the Swedish immigrants would drink coffee and eat svenska bullar, Swedish bread, and gossip. And so it was kind of like, yes, this is the room of going to church maybe, or touching into the other world, and life goes on in this way. I also really wanted to read that piece because some of the people that I've known closely and people that I've worked with usually have somebody at a very early age that had that kind of imprint upon them. It would be like familiar. So there's the next story that I'm telling that's called Stepping Outside the Self. So there's a lot more about my grandmother here, but this is a different impact for me. And this was in my early 20s. And it's a man that we call Professor Lili Ta. Professor Lili Ta was my Pakwa, Chinese boxing and Tai Chi teacher during my mid-20s. He was a recent immigrant from China, and he would teach a small group of us twice a week on a vacant tennis court. And every so often I would travel to Chinatown in San Francisco to another class he held in the park. He was a straightforward person with a quiet, persuasive demeanor. And though he never spoke about it, I learned he was also an accomplished painter and calligrapher. I actually have one of his calligraphies in my office. I had a difficult time understanding his instructions, so I carefully watched his movements, which told stories of unlimited grace, balance, and focused power. His crooked nose looked like it had been broken before, and the scar that ran through his eyebrow was said to have been evidence that he had earned his fighting credentials on the back streets of Beijing. He moved like a smooth, deep, flowing river that could quickly turn into an explosive cataract. Working with me one day, he continually and effortlessly threw me off balance when I tried to grab or strike him. This wasn't particularly unusual, but there was a stepped up severity to his throws and counters. He spent more time with me than usual, and his punches had more sting in them. When I tried to deflect of his attacks, he easily pushed me away. Actually, it was more like bouncing off an oak tree. While I knew it was an honor to have this much personal teaching from him, I was edgy knowing that he could be unpredictable. After telling me repeatedly to relax, he sighed deeply, took me by the arm, and guided me to the edge of the practice area. Inexplicably, he began to tell me about an early Chinese painter named Wu Dazi. The segue from his martial arts critiques to the history of Chinese art was abrupt. I was bewildered, but also vigilant in case he tried something while he had me cornered, like sweep my feet from out under me or strike me painfully in a nerve center, as he had done before. However, instead of attacking me, Professor Lili Ta patiently explained to me about Wu Dazi, a Tang Dynasty artist who is sometimes named as one of the great philosophers of China. According to the professor, this is what he told me, Wu Dazi could paint images of the mythic rain-producing dragons that were so realistic that water poured from them. He could also paint 100-foot scrolls in a single uninterrupted flow, draw perfect circles with his eyes closed, and made worlds emerge effortlessly from his brushstrokes. As I was trying to find a connection between Tai Chi and the story of an ancient Chinese painter, the professor gripped my shoulder and said, "Listen," looked at me really directly, held up a finger, "Listen." One day, Wu Dazi began painting the landscape on the wall of the emperor's palace. He started at one end and quickly moved down the wall, painting mountains and rivers and forest. When he came to the end, he painted a cave, stepped into it, and disappeared. Professor Lili Ta held my gaze for a long moment. "Do you understand?" he asked me. I didn't understand. I shook my head no. Professor Lili Ta's hand on my shoulder seemed to get heavier. He looked at me thoughtfully and he said, "He disappeared, but the painting remained. He disappeared, but the painting remained. Do you understand now?" I told him I wasn't sure. He looked at me as a sympathetic teacher would look at a dull student. Then he nodded his head at some inner knowing and led me back into the practice area. He seemed sad. Patting my shoulders, he said, "Then relax these." And tapping my belly, he said, "And breathe here." Then he turned and walked away. He didn't seem critical, but I had the feeling that some part of him was resigned to my ignorance. So this event with Mr. Lili Ta, although that it didn't have a strong penetrating effect to me other than his presence and his deep commitment and his ground of being, that over time on my investigations and my inquiry into path, mystery, somatics, meditation. What does it mean to really be a full human being? What he opened up at that point was that the art, or what this Chinese painter, philosopher, mystic did, stayed while the self he was released. And, in many years later, I came across the words of the Zen priest Dogen, 13th century Japan. And he said, to be on a path is to study the self. And to study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be one with the 10,000 things. And all of my teachers basically said, if I'm serious and committed and sincere on this path of awakening, that there's something you're going to have to let go of. This could be thought of, as I've seen over time, as my thinking self, my making up stories about how the world should be, my conceptual self, my cognitive self. Not that those disappear, because they're necessary in terms of living our life out, but not trying to construct a reality in which myself or my ego is at the center of it. And like so many wise people say, there is no inseparable self. There is no self separate from others. And if we look really closely, we can actually come to a place when we say, who is this self that's even speaking right now? And that lesson was really introduced to me at that moment, even though, like in many ways, my grandmother, I didn't know that that was a lesson, but it was kind of a place of like, if you held maybe there's seeds, I have seeds that I collected the oak trees here around their ranch. And all of a sudden, for no reason, maybe too much water, not enough water, a lot of heat, too cold, they suddenly burst open. And in that bursting open, there's this moment of going, oh, this is when that seed was planted way back then. And it also reminds me that even now those seeds are being planted, and I may not be able to put my arms around them, but there's something that's planted in me in that way. And if I can just hold them, and I mean holding them by being embodied, by holding them in my soma, not by just having the thoughts about them, but feeling how they live in me and how they want to come to grow. And in many ways, that's keeping alive this notion of our longing. Here was another moment that was very powerful in my life, and it lives to this day. The title of this chapter is called Dignifying Fear and Vulnerability. Dignifying Fear and Vulnerability. My father was a career Navy officer. He enlisted after high school, fought in World War II in Korea, and as a promising seaman was promoted to warrant officer. In other words, he started as a high school graduate, became an enlisted man, not somebody without any further education, and worked his way up. It was called a warrant officer. In the idiom of the military, warrant officers are called Mustangs, like they're wild. They were seasoned enlisted personnel that became officers without needing a college education. They were experienced, tested, hardened, smart, trusted to handle the toughest jobs, and had zero capacity to put up with any bullshit. So those elements of my father, plus PTSD, which didn't exist back then, made him a major figure in my life. When he returned after being at sea for the better part of a year, we would go down to the docks and welcome him back. There was music being played, bands playing, sailors kissing their wives and girlfriends, children being held up. And my first memory, my first distinct memory of my father was when I was 7 years old. He had recently returned from a year-long cruise to the Far East. He had all the trappings of the hero warriors with his ribbons, medal, uniform, sidearm, and distinctive military bearing. What left a lasting impression was an event that happened shortly after he returned and is reinforced throughout the time we lived together and well beyond. We'd been out for a walk in the Navy housing projects where we lived. I basked in the glow of being special, just me and him walking down the street with me holding his hand. I belonged. I was safe. I had a secure place in the aura of the hero warrior father. You know, his picture with his uniform was always around. And the joke in our family was that I would go to any man I saw with a uniform like the postman and milkman wear uniforms or a policeman. And I'd say, "Are you my father?" Much to the chagrin of my mother. So we're walking down the street. It's this really warm, fuzzy feeling. He's back after a year. I have a father and I'm really under his care. Ahead of us were 3 men sitting on a bus stop bench. And as we approached, they stood and blocked the sidewalk. So we would either have to step into the street to get by or apologetically wiggle through them. I quickly learned that my father was neither the apologetic or wiggle through type. My connection to him suddenly and radically collapsed. There was now a tautness, a collecting of will, a coiled spring without feeling or warmth, a weighted, undeterred intent. I'm talking about his presence, his ambiance. I was confused. The known world had abruptly shifted and my entire existence retreated into my father's tightened grip. There was a simultaneous flexing and extending in him, as if a serpent from some older order was responding to the impulse of a primordial instinct. He pushed through the knot of men with me in tow. One of them grabbed my father by the elbow as if to block his progress. My father released my hand, pivoted into the man and kneed him in the groin. He grabbed another by his jacket and hit him in the face. The third man ran down the street with my father in pursuit, yelling, "You son of a bitch, get the hell out of here." The world became opaque without depth or dimension, the sky bending around me. Then my vision tunneled. It was like a spotlight, narrow and tight, the periphery indistinct. I could see 2 men lying on the sidewalk. One was tightly curled, holding his groin and moaning. The other sat limp and dazed, his face covered in blood. The images consumed me as if they had agency separate from my 7-year-old world. The hero warrior father was a savior. He had protected me from danger and outnumbered. He had triumphed over injustice. He had rescued me. But the hero warrior father was also terrifying, violent, unpredictable. He was dangerous. The calculus of how to relate to this man, my father, had quickly increased in complexity to an order of magnitude that was wholly incomprehensible to me. A new world had been disclosed that was impossible for me to grasp. There was a contradiction present that I could not name, but knew only as a sensation of a simultaneous pushing away and a pulling toward. My rib cage thickened against my galloping breath. There were now 2 voices that equally made sense, but stood in a fierce opposition to each other. The perception of wholeness in which I knew myself a moment ago splintered into separate parts, tugging and competing with each other. I wanted to scream and I wanted to give thanks. My hands wanted to curl into fist, to pummel and defend. My heart wanted to grieve, to soften. My pulse pounded. A dark lump parked in my throat. Vigilance coated the edge of my skin. My stomach clawed and released. Though I couldn't name it then, this was fear. I was afraid. A complex of sensations and narratives began to organize me to either fight or run. At the time, I didn't know that fear would be a primary and fundamental teacher for me. I only knew I needed to pay attention to this man because my father, because my life depended upon it. He returned, his breath labored, grabbing my hand as if it were pulling a plant out of the ground, lifting me to my toes. He glanced down at me, his face distorted and red as if a cane fire were burning below the surface. His features resembled and seethed, and like a malevolent god, he glared at the men at our feet, his eyes hard, jaw muscles rippling in a promise of reckoning. He released my hand and rubbed the knuckles of one hand in the palm of the other. He looked down the street where the other had fled. The man with the bloody face bowed his head and raised his hand in submission, uttering something incomprehensible. There was a roaring in my ears. They were broken, hurt, and I wanted him to see that and not inflict any more pain. I wanted to leave, to let them be, but I was petrified to say anything at all, to move myself in any way that would set him off. I wanted to be gone from this place, to be gone from them, to bury this entire episode as if it never happened. I'd been told that perhaps this was compassion, but it felt more like dread, a sense of self-preservation to avoid any more of his terrifying violence. He looked hard at them, snorted, and turned away with me in hand. I simultaneously felt fear and relief as we walked away. The violence had stopped, possibly gone, yet the purveyor of the violence was walking next to me. The hero warrior father was alive, seething and pulsating, holding my hand. The shape of this experience was fear, but I didn't know how to birth the sensation into language. From the depths of the unconscious, a voice said, "You have no tools or resources to deal with this. So bury it, or you will go crazy." Deep, deep sense of compartmentalization, important. So I helped it find a home deep in a dark corner of my consciousness. I stored it in my cells and locked the experience away. It takes energy to keep this fear door shut, and this was a wise survival strategy at the time. In order to return to the appearance of a norm, it required that I construct narratives and behaviors that presented self-reliance, bravery, and an undaunted vigilance against showing fear. This somatic strategy also obscured the solitude, separateness, and loneliness I felt. In the moment, I knew I needed to pay attention to this man, my father, and ultimately to all men, which I came to learn included myself because of a dark, violent response to a real or perceived threat that lurks within us. The moment I knew I needed to pay attention to this man, my father, and ultimately to all men, which I came to learn included myself, because of a dark, violent response to a real or perceived threat that lurks within us. I came to understand that this level of violence lived very close to the surface in my father, placing me at perpetual risk, which was confirmed as I grew older. I needed to pay attention to avoid being the target of his wrath. And paradoxically, I was grateful that my father would protect me. Fear, safety, loss, and vigilance became intimately fused together as a survival strategy. in ways that I wouldn't understand until years later. Safety was in attending to the behaviors, signals, and moods of my father, and this was eventually transferred to others. It was the beginning of understanding the emotion of fear. It was the commencement of training my attention. These were my early meditations. We walked home in a very different state from which we had left, as if this event was a template of Hans Christian Andersen's persuasively simple but profound fable about an emperor's new wardrobe. What was stripped away from me was an inherited innocence, a willful fantasy of the parameters of safety, the ideal notion of the father-son relationship. This was a moment in which I was asked to shed the embodiment, the story, or clothes, if you wish, of what I imagined my father to be, and take on a new set of clothes, although I had no idea what that was at this point. Again, this was at this place, as I look back, going, yes, something I had to let go of, something I had to let go into. As I say, here again was the theme of letting go of something and letting go into something as a way of transformation, or at this early age, a necessity to ensure my safety and survival. When we arrived home, he disappeared, and my mother looked at me curiously. Immediately, I began shaking, and tears rolled down my face. She reached for me, then I heard my father's voice. He's okay, quit crying. When she inquired again, he brushed her off and turned away. Nothing happened to him, he's okay. I was crying and trying not to cry. My face was contorting to control the tears, my body trembling uncontrollably. I was torn between my mother's embrace and the commands of my father. What happened? She asked more forcefully. Nothing happened, nothing at all. He's fine. His voice rose. Stop crying. There's nothing to cry about, for God's sake. Quit babying him. This was a pivotal moment that framed the path of what it meant to be a man. I wasn't supposed to cry. I wasn't supposed to feel comfort with a female. Being afraid was unacceptable, and letting my body shake was shameful. The only emotion acceptable to me was anger. I was supposed to be brave, even heroic, and violence was not only allowed, but valorously linked to these manly virtues. Aggression was a legitimate path to being a man, but the truth was that I was afraid. But to belong, I had to squash my fear to avoid loss of belonging. If I told other males that I was afraid, it was a sure way to be rejected. It was the same for expressing grief, sadness, regret, shame, confusion, and guilt. Love and tenderness were permissible with dogs, cats, and horses, but not with humans. Camaraderie and celebration had their place in sports and martial arts as quick hugs, back pounding, pats on the butt, or a festive hooting, but no other emotions were allowed if you wanted to be part of the pack. In other words, the best way not to belong, to be excluded from the inner circle, was to express fear in any form. Another aspect of this code was not to give in to pain or injury. You were rewarded to play through the pain and not complain. This was being tough, a key virtue in the neighborhoods, dojos, and gyms that I grew up in. So there was this learning from my grandmother, who was love and compassion and deep, deep understanding. And then my father, who was wounded, deeply wounded. And I've done much, much work with him, on him, who's passed. And I have forgiveness for him and understanding, but violent, really violent, and was in a long line of transmission from males, one to another, about this notion. So those are some of the stories here. I'm going to see here. Let me just open it up here and say, is there any questions? Do you have any questions? And Lisa, could you either see people raising their hands or calling somebody? I'd like, if you call them, I'd like to see somebody, but you can raise your hand too.
Sure. Yeah, so feel free if you have any questions to use the raise your hand function. Here we go, people are doing that, awesome. And then I'll invite you to come off mute. Francine, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Yes. What did you mean by keeping alive the notion of our longing?
Francine, would you ask that question again, please?
What did you mean by keeping alive the notion of our longing?
Yes, yes, or longing. Yeah, you know, the Sufis call it fakir. The word in Farsi is fakir, and it means homesickness. That what was revealed to me was there was this notion that I longed for something more than the artifacts, the traditions, the customs, the etiquettes, the way of seeing the world that I both inherited from my social condition.
Could someone mute? I'm missing what Richard is saying.
Everybody would mute. Thank you. That all of those things I inherited from my social conditionings, the social conditions, or I had adopted, that I knew there was something more than all this. I would say now I could feel this ground of being that was divine and sacred and spiritual, and had nothing to do with, it had nothing to do with the acquiring of material things or producing a certain identity or a ego enhancement. And my experience, friends, I felt that in my body, and I was taught that's a feeling. Yes, it's a story and a narrative, but it's a feeling. If I can get in touch with that feeling in my body, just like it's a very small flame, and then give it oxygen, give it attention, and if I pay attention to it, it will grow. And it feels like if I use the word soul or essence, that it allows this deeper part of me to come to life. And in that, I've come to see that it makes life much more fulfilling, much more rich, much more nuanced. But to answer your question, this notion, if I get in touch with where it lives in my body and pay attention to it in terms of what's its shape, what's its color, what's its movement, what is it saying to me?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Francine. Dennis, I think you had your hand up next. Would you like to come off mute?
Richard, I read with appreciation and interest your account of your grandchildren, the essay about working with them and the wisdom of that working together. I so appreciate you beginning with Dog Creek. The importance of that awareness, even in the body of an 8-year-old. Because my impression is that many people give the back of the hand to the young, to the little ones, as though they're not prescient, they're not wise. And so I'm having the blessing of journeying with my 7-year-old granddaughter. And she asked me such beautiful, direct questions, including, when are you going to die, Grandpa? I want to know. So thank you for beginning your book with this account of Dog Creek and the import of that on the life of an 8-year-old. So thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks, Dennis. Let's go, Bobby. I see your hand up. Hello, nice to see you. Would you like to come off mute?
That would help. Hi, everybody. Hi, Richard. Hi, Lisa. Lovely to see your faces. Richard, thank you so much for that. It's an observation and a question within it. I was struck by the story about the calf, and what appeared in my understanding of how you were describing it was that there was a level of self that was copying the actions of your uncle with the taking off of the scarf and doing it. And I suppose the question is twofold was there anything happening beneath, so that there was an awareness of a self that you were copying, but something else that you wanted to do or be? And that struggle sometimes when we have that level of self, but we're letting ourselves, I'm not explaining it very well, but letting ourselves get in the way of something that's happening behind that.
Yes, I understand the question well. Well, Bobby, yeah, there was, so he was, every time I would go to the ranch and work over periods of time, and he was a certain kind of a model for me, rough man, rancher, but a certain kind of model at that age and that time in history for myself. And, in that moment, it was, what was underneath it was like this bewilderment and this kind of shock, like we're doing this best thing to bring this calf to life. Calf had to do with sustenance for the family, for their occupation. It lived, but that heifer died. So I was like baffled and bewildered and kind of shocked. And then further shocked by the show of tenderness that he showed. And in the moment where we both looked at each other and had that shared feeling, if I look back, what was in there at that moment would be, can we commune with this in this moment? Can we take a moment and really allow ourselves to feel what's actually coming out of this particular incident? And then he went right back to business. And like I said in the book, he said, and he already had learned that men don't do that. That was the model, and that model started to get passed down to me. But underneath it was really like, this is something, and I think I had that because of being with my grandmother, that place. And it was like, if we could just stop here and be with that would be lovely.
Thank you. The choice of self. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll come to you, David, with your hand up. Come off mute.
Well, hi, Richard. It's so nice to see that side of you just sinking into your storytelling like that. I'm really looking forward to reading the book and scooping up some more of those stories. I've heard you talk before, and you did today, about the role that teachers have played in your life and practices have played in your life. And I'm just wondering, now that you're turning 78 and I just turned 74, so it's on my mind, what role do you see teachers? I'm sure many of you, the teachers in your lineage, I've seen your table of that, are deceased. And I'm just wondering what role you see teachers and practices playing as you become more elderly.
Yeah. Hi, David. Thank you. Well, I'll say in the broadest sense, I have an eye out for them, for sure, and where they may be. And often they appear, as Dennis said, in my 7, 8, 9-year-old, 5-year-old grandchildren. And in their, their unsocialized selves, speaking really authentically and directly all the time. And it's clearly that, and what I also get to see is myself with them. And that helps me see myself at this age too. Like, how am I with this young wonder plant and being with them in a way? And is it coherent with my principles and my values? So yes, they're my teachers, and also they're reflecting back to me about teaching. Thanks for the question, and good to see you, David.
Likewise. Talking to you from Germany, but this really closes the distance. Very powerful medium. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, David. Carrie, I see your hand. Do you want to come off mute?
Hi, Carrie.
Hi, Richard. Wow, lovely to see you. So I'm curious, you've talked about the intimacy of this story, which is so apparent and lovely to be with you in the sharing of that. So what I'm curious about is how is it having put language and structure to these memories, to these influences, how is it in the world now for you? What's shifted that this is public?
In many ways, I felt this about every book I've written, this one more than ever, but in a way, they're like children that grow up. In other words, this no longer belongs to me. It belongs to the world, and the world would do what it has with it. That produces a feeling in me of, I cherish that. I'm vulnerable because of that. I'm looking forward to how that child does in the world, how it moves people. And, but especially with this book, it is the very first time in my writing that characters and events started to write themselves. Like I started this piece out with my father around, he was my first meditation teacher, that because I had so much to focus on him and go, how do I act when I'm around him? Because he would be violent and very moody and contentious. And then the story about him just came out, and it was like I couldn't not write it. Clearly, I was at choice, but it just had to come out, and that was very, very. In many ways, it was very painful. In many ways, it revisited a trauma, deep trauma for me in the work that I've done with him. And it was also deeply healing, deeply, deeply healing. I get backwash around, did I say too much? Or did I not say enough? So it has a large piece of that. When I say that, a large piece of all those elements in it, in writing this, which is, it's taking away the veil of many parts of my life, not only to the reader, I think, but also to myself.
Yeah.
Very healing. Thanks for the question.
Welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. I think we have one more, Richard. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, one more.
All right, one more. Bonnie, do you want to come off mute and share?
I just wanted to thank you as a fellow elder. So many of us are reflecting on our lives and what we do going forward. And for me, the way you structured with the ideas and then your reflections now about them, I'm not clear whether those were thoughts that you had at the time or they are your adult views, but I think that's going to be very helpful in my reading of your book. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. I go further into that in my introduction, that I know that I would have moments to go, is that what really happened, or was I that age, or what's the overlay of those things?
Yeah.
And what I've come to know about narratives, and the universe is made up of stories, as the poet says, not atoms, is that we do layers upon our past histories, and they become their own pieces.
Mhm.
Yeah. I know we want to, there's one more piece I want to read here, and then let's take some time. I want to talk about the great things we're doing at SI. Logan, this is under the chapter, The Sensation of Longing, The Sensation of Longing. Logan, my youngest grandson, stood about mid-thigh to me. I was in conversation with Django, his dad, but I could feel him tugging on my pants leg. I reached down and tousled his hair, but kept talking. He took my hand and tugged at it. I twirled him absently while I continued the conversation. He grabbed my hand with both of his and tried to pull himself up. I finally looked down in exasperation. What, Logan? I said. He was on his toes, reaching up with both hands, arms fully extended, his glistening eyes locking into mine, and he said, Uppy. It was like a light piercing my heart. Uppy, he repeated, as I stooped down, placing my hands under his arms. This was the ancient gesture of longing. Arms, eyes, voice, hands, breath, and heart reaching up and out toward the universe, calling in the next order of significance. All of my children embodied this shape with me at some point, and then my grandchildren. And I've consistently seen children across 5 continents embody this form of reaching out for the mystery, for love, for contact, for more. More is in italics, reaching out for more. There is a Genesis moment when the sacred longing is a felt, sensate spark that opens our heart to a world more spacious than our current reality. This moment of somatic awakening is often articulated as one of the following. I now see I can inhabit myself and the world more fully by feeling. I recognize I have an emotional life that can inform and enrich me. There's an energy, a certain power that I can organize toward a life-affirming purpose. There is something beyond my personality that is wise, compassionate, and self-generating. If I shift my perception, I see the situation in a more life-affirming way. So I wanted to put that in here because this sense of longing, while it's really at the end of the book, is a thread that goes all the way through it. And I believe it was really implanted by who knows, but clearly by my grandmother. And not only what my grandmother could do as a healer and a psychic and a spiritual being, but really by her presence and who she was and how that presence was reflected in the world. And I would really go ask myself, if I had the words at a young age, but clearly later, what does it mean to have that kind of presence? And essentially all of my teachers, that's what I looked for in them. Could they do amazing things? Absolutely. Whether in martial arts or meditation or healing or somatics, absolutely. But it was something about who they were that informed me. And I'm going to see if I can find this other piece here around longing in our short period of time. Oh boy, I can keep reading or not reading. Lise, what did you want to, anything you want to announce here? We're at time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Richard. And thank you all to everyone for joining us. We're so happy to have had the opportunity to celebrate this book launch with all of you. We want to take a moment just to let you know that the book is currently available on Kindle. Sounds like some of you have already found it and reading it through Amazon, and it will be available in paperback on July the 5th. And right now, Holly is going to put in the chat the link to Simon and Schuster, who are actually distributing the book, and have a list of retailers where you can pre-order the book as well. So the chat and the link is in the chat for you now. Just a few other things. If you don't know about the Strozzi Institute courses and programs, or would like to know more about specific offers that are upcoming, please take a look at our website. Holly will put some links in the chat, or you can schedule a call with Denise, our enrollment director, and we would look forward to hearing from you or seeing you on the mat if you feel called to do so. So with that, Richard, any closing words you'd like to say?
Yes, yes. What I would like to do is I found this piece I would like to read. I know that a lot of you said you're going to go to this time. If you need to step off, please step off. But this is the chapter, the second to last chapter, The Sensation of Longing. And I start by doing this because this was an amazing 14 months for Aikido, Two-Rock Aikido. It was the first full moon of December, and in the fading light, we began the Aikido classes. A red fox sat in silhouette, still and noble against the deepening sky, confident of all that may be asked of it. As though it felt our attention, it trotted the ridgeline northwest in crepuscular time. Overhead in the night sky, Saturn trailed Jupiter in readiness for their inevitable conjunction at the end of the month. And this was a time where we were all in mask. We had our dojo outside. We kept distance. We did mostly weapons work. And we moved through all kinds of different kinds of weather and constellations and configurations. And it was just a wonderful moving time to actually do it outside. It was almost as if when we went out, the birds sang, the animals came around, the trees started to wave, and we were in this, we were in the land as we should be. And at one point, there was coyotes on the southern edge of Two Rock Valley that were howling one night. It was just really incredible. And at the very end, where we sent out loving kindness and healing energy from the positive key that we generate, we said, let's send it right down to them. We sent it down to them, and they were silent for a moment and howled again. Hours later, I was wakened by their calling. I immediately sat up, a charge rising up through my skin and the hair in my arms in response to their ancient howls. They were much closer than they had been earlier, and a response to their yelps came from the other end of the valley. I stopped outside as if commanded by their call and response and walked to the field in the full moonlight. I stopped in the orchard and listened. The silence was so deep, it was as if the universe itself had stopped, waiting expectantly for what to come. Then, as if the coyotes themselves were nesting against my ear, their primal cries, majestic and grave, broke the quiet, igniting something in me I could only call a longing, a pull reverberating deep in the cave of my heart. I felt compelled to join them. And when I tried to replace their yelps, I felt foolish and inauthentic, as if co-opting something not native to me. Yet I knew there was a sound in me that wanted to come to life. I waited and listened to them, to their next chorus. Then I followed with a hi-ya, as loud as I could, as we do in the dojo, as loud as I could. The night swallowed the sound. The silence was deafening, and my lungs filled with the cool air. I extended my arms and raised my eyes to the night sky, and without thinking, I shouted, "Hello, I'm here. Hello, I'm here," just like this. The night, the familiar, indistinct feeling of longing rose in me. paradoxically filling me and calling me to be filled. Mr. Coyote, the trickster, reminded me of the formidable archetypal energy of the longing that has been with me since I had remembering, the longing that had many names, but what was present at that time is what Georgia O'Keeffe called the faraway nearby. So one of the things that we teach at Strozzi Institute, regardless of who comes, is really, is this longing inside of you? Is this longing inside of you? And does all the news and the events of the day and our the adaptations of our social conditions cover up that? And is it possible to really tune into that longing and to see what it wants, what it opens for us in the next stage of our journey? So let me say, why don't we all come off mute? Everybody come off mute. And let's wave at each other and say, so long. See you.
Long.
Hi, everyone.
Everybody.
See you.
See everybody.
Thank everybody around the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
That was great.
Blessings.
Thank
in
you,
this
Richard.
work.
Thank you.
Thank
You all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Wonderful experience. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, everyone.
Reluctance to leave.
You all.